All right, so the second section of your chapter examines how the Constitution structures the federal system in the United States. In this video lecture, we will look at relevant provisions of the Constitution, starting with provisions that favor strong federal powers, and then looking at provisions favoring strong state powers. Finally, we will touch on constitutional provisions regarding interstate relations, in other words, how states are supposed to deal with one another. An important starting point for this discussion is Article 6 in the Constitution, which states, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land." The statement's pretty clear. Where federal and state laws conflict, federal law wins. The one limiting factor, though, is that the federal law itself has to be constitutional. So long as federal law is made in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution, it is supreme over state law. This principle was put into practice in the landmark Supreme Court case of McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. In this case, the United States had established a nationally chartered bank, including a branch in Maryland. Maryland did not care for this, as they preferred state-chartered banks, and saw this as the federal government stepping on their toes. So they tried to tax the national bank. In the case that ensued, Chief Justice John Marshall argued that Maryland's tax conflicted with the federal law creating the federal bank. Because of the National Supremacy Clause, Maryland's law was ruled unconstitutional, establishing that states cannot undermine federal institutions by trying to tax them out of existence. The next major provision establishing federal government powers is Article 1, Section 8, which contains what are called the Enumerated Powers. These are the powers explicitly listed in the Constitution. Your text lists these in some detail, so I'm just going to highlight a couple that are particularly important. The first is the Interstate Commerce Clause, which reads, "Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states." This clause is particularly important because it is the main constitutional provision that justifies federal regulatory law in regards to the economy. Things like minimum wage, the Affordable Care Act, environmental standards, workplace safety rules, even civil rights law are largely based on the Interstate Commerce Clause. The second powerhouse, enumerated power, is the General Welfare Clause. It reads, "Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States." So this clause allows the United States government to raise revenue directly for national purposes. This represented a major change from the Articles of Confederation, in which the national government had no taxing power. Because the federal government has the power to raise money directly, it is able to effectively fund programs to promote the common defense and general welfare. The last major provision in the Constitution establishing a strong national government that I'd like to call your attention to is the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's also sometimes called the Implied Powers Clause because the powers it gives to the federal government are implied rather than directly spelled out. It says Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, in other words, the enumerated powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. This clause provides the constitutional basis for nearly everything the federal government does today, simply because the enumerated powers, if they were strictly interpreted, would greatly limit the range of activities the federal government could engage in. To flesh this out a bit, let's look again at McCulloch v. Maryland. Not only did this landmark case establish the practical application of the National Supremacy Clause, it also established broad application of the Necessary and Proper Clause. Just to refresh, this case revolved around the establishment of a national bank chapter in the state of Maryland. Maryland argued that the federal government did not have the power to establish such a bank because banking is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. That was certainly true. However, the enumerated powers in the Constitution do give the federal government the power to issue currency, borrow funds, and collect taxes. According to the Supreme Court, it was necessary and proper for the federal government to establish a bank so that it could carry out those enumerated powers. This case is a good example of how the necessary and proper clause adds meat to the bones of the enumerated powers. Against those provisions for a strong national government, the Constitution is relatively light on language empowering the states. This is mainly due to the fact that the framers understood that states were the level of government where most of the day-to-day governance took place. They did not think it was necessary to mention that the states would continue to legislate for public health and safety, community morals, and criminal law because it was just assumed they would continue doing these things. However, the Anti-Federalists who had opposed the Constitution, largely on the grounds that it gave too much power to the federal government, wanted some assurances that state powers would be protected. So the 10th Amendment, the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, says, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." This is basically a safety valve amendment. Those in favor of stronger state power have argued that it should apply in cases in which it is unclear whether or not the federal government has the power to do something. For most of United States history, it did not have much practical application, as very few Supreme Court cases referenced it to strike down something the federal government wanted to do. However, that has changed a bit in recent decades, as the court has started to rule more frequently in favor of state power. One example is Prince versus the United States. This had to do with gun regulations and a federal law requiring states to carry out background checks for gun purchases. A local sheriff argued that this was an overstep by the federal government, that it essentially commandeered local law enforcement, turning them into agents of the federal government. The court agreed with this, arguing that local police departments couldn't be forced into doing the background checks on behalf of the federal government. Ultimately, this was worked out by the background check system being changed to get around this issue. Finally, the Constitution contains provisions about how states should interact with one another. The Full Faith and Credit Clause details that states must accept the acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. This is hugely important for things like family law. If you are married in one state, you will be recognized as a married couple in every other state. If you adopt a child in one state, your adoption will be accepted as legitimate in other states. If you get divorced in one state, your divorce is recognized throughout the country. Extradition has to do with returning fugitives from justice back to the states where they are wanted for trial. And privileges and immunities means that the citizens of each state have the same rights as citizens of every other state. It basically means that states cannot discriminate against out-of-staters. Although what constitutes discrimination is a matter of some debate. For instance, the courts have found that public universities may charge higher tuition to out-of-state students without violating this privileges and immunities clause. So just to sum up, the Constitution contains specific provisions laying out the roles of the states and federal government, but these provisions are pretty broad and their meaning is often disputed. That broad language has allowed for periods of U.S. history in which the powers of the federal government were pretty limited and periods in which they were pretty expansive. That is the topic of our next video.